Welcome back to our series on Mark. And our message is titled, Do Not Fear, Only Believe. Words of Jesus from our passage, words to the synagogue ruler, Jairus. And this short instruction covers two things, faith and fear. And it makes me think of some of the commonly used ideas that I've heard around to talk about faith, and talk about faith particularly in the face of fear. If you are in a dangerous situation, like say a burning building, when a firefighter comes to rescue you, even though you are afraid, you need to trust the firefighter. And instead of panicking, you need to calm down and follow instructions and allow the firefighter to lead you or carry you out of the burning building alive. Similarly, if you're drowning and a lifeguard gets a hold of you, even though you are afraid, you need to trust the lifeguard and resist flailing about madly and let the lifeguard rescue you. In both cases, you need to exercise faith in the face of fear. Well, today's passage brings us two accounts where we see faith in the face of fear. Jesus' encounter with Jairus and Jesus' encounter with the bleeding woman. We also have one account of the complete opposite of that, where Jesus is rejected by his own hometown of Nazareth. And together, these three accounts teach us about faith. So let's have a look at them. Now, after casting out a legion of demons from a man, which you might remember from last week's sermon, Jesus traveled back across a lake, strangely called the Sea of Galilee. And on landing, he was met by a large crowd and a prominent man, Jairus. Jairus comes to Jesus, but it must have been very difficult for Jairus to come to Jesus. In previous chapters of Mark, we saw that the religious leaders of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees and the synagogue leaders, they hated Jesus. They hated him to the point of plotting to kill him. As a synagogue leader, one of the religious leaders himself, Jairus would have had to overcome problems of pride, prejudice, shame and embarrassment, and risk the great anger of others. But Jairus had an overriding fear in the form of these terrible words: "My little daughter is dying." His beloved 12-year-old daughter was sick and on the brink of death, and he knew it. And this fear brought him to fall at Jesus' feet. But it was also faith that drew him to Jesus. What did he plead with Christ? "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." He had no doubt that he had no doubt heard of Jesus' miraculous healing of others, and he believed. Despite all the other forces acting on him and opinions that were around him, he knew and had faith that Jesus had power over disease. He was convinced that all he needed was for Jesus to touch her and she would be healed and live. And Mark doesn't record Jesus saying anything, only his immediate action, that he responds in care and compassion for this desperate father and went with him. However, here the story turns to another person, not a 12-year-old girl, but an unnamed woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. In Old Testament law, the menstrual cycle made women unclean for a time, but this woman's abnormal, continual bleeding was far more serious. She had been perpetually unclean for 12 years, not only suffering physical pain and weakness from the constant blood loss, but also constant isolation and emotional distress. She had been both chronically ill and chronically alone. And not only that, she had also spent all her money on many doctors, though none of them could finally heal or help her. She lived a despairing, fearful existence without safety and full of uncertainty. But then, the woman heard about Jesus and his power over disease, and her hope and faith were awakened. She heard the reports and she believed. Jesus was the one who could help her leave this horrible life that she had lived in for the past 12 years. She became convinced, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And like Jairus, it was probably quite scary for an unclean woman to come to Jesus. She wasn't supposed to be there. Yet there she was, sneaking through the crowd, making everyone unclean, those who touched her and those around her. The consequences would have been terrible if she was found out. But her desperation to be healed was greater than any fears that she otherwise might have had. Her plan was simple: sneak in, get healed, and leave. However, on touching Jesus, she felt the immediate and complete healing of her body, and she was then also immediately seized by an even greater fear, to the point where her whole body was trembling. She had just experienced Jesus' amazing power firsthand and was now very conscious that she was standing in the presence of one whose greatness and glory she didn't fully understand. Much like the other disciples who feared when Jesus calmed the storm. They didn't say, "Oh, how nice." No, they were terrified when they came face to face with Jesus' raw power. And when Jesus stopped and asked, "Who touched me?" to her credit, instead of running away, she stepped out in faith again, falling before Jesus to confess everything and to place herself at the mercy of this very great person. And her faith was rewarded, for God is a God of love. Jesus restored her not just physically, but socially and spiritually. He called her daughter, a greatly affectionate term that he only ever calls one person in the Gospel of Mark, this lady. And he said in the crowd's hearing that her faith had healed her. Now everybody knew that she was healed and she was clean. And she left knowing not just God's healing, but his dignity and love. But just as this woman's fear and faith were resolved, Jairus' worst fear came true as the news of his daughter died. Now, in a hospital, if a wounded person is at risk of dying, there would be a flurry of activity by many different people trying to save or revive that person. But the moment a doctor declares he's gone or she's gone, all activity, all human effort immediately ceases. And it's not that the nurses and doctors and medics and staff no longer care. It's just realistic. Once the time of death is declared, there's just no more point. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? And I wonder about the struggle in Jairus' heart at this moment, the sinking feeling, the cold chill that must have seized him. Jesus knew it full well and turned to comfort and strengthen him with these words, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Or in another translation, "Do not fear, only believe." And Jesus' words here have the sense of keep on believing. Jairus had so far shown faith in Jesus in coming to him. Jesus was now telling him to keep having faith, even in the face of dread and sorrow, even though it now seemed hopeless. Well, to Jairus' credit, at Jesus' words, Jairus did continue to have faith. And like the bleeding woman, his faith was also rewarded. He obeyed Jesus, brought him to the house. And with only Jairus and his wife, and Peter and James and John in the room, Jesus took the dead girl by the hand and said tenderly to her, "Little girl, get up." And she did. Before this account, Mark had shown his readers Jesus' power over the elements, his power over demons, his power over disease. Now, for the first time, readers of Mark witness Jesus' power over death. But after these two dramatic, interwoven accounts of faith and power, in the last part of today's passage, Mark actually brings us to the very disappointing and really rather short account of Jesus' visit to Nazareth. The town as a whole was so faithless that Jesus was not actually able to do much there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. Yeah, the account is really short because there was nothing to say. Why the lack of faith in Nazareth? Well, the townspeople thought that they knew everything there was to know about Jesus since he grew up there. Isn't this the carpenter, Mary's son, whose brothers and sisters we know or are among us? This is a perfect example of a phrase that you might know: familiarity breeds contempt. The Nazarenes held Jesus in contempt. They were suspicious of and offended by him. How could someone so familiar get all this wisdom and power? Maybe there was even a sense of indignation. How dare this person that we knew as a young boy act superior to us now? Ultimately, the people of Nazareth were so preoccupied with doubting Jesus one way or another that there was no space for believing in him and the message of the kingdom of God that he was preaching, the message of healing and new life. And we're told that Jesus himself was amazed at their lack of faith. So, those are the three accounts of today. Two accounts of great faith, one account of unfaith. What do we learn from these? I should probably say, first up, that the wrong lesson to take from this is that if you have faith, you will be healed in this life. That's not what we learn. Even though we have two accounts that show faith being rewarded with healing and life, and one account showing the direct opposite, today's passage is not a lesson in how to secure healing in the here and now. As Pastor Charlie told us a few weeks ago in a previous sermon, healing is one of God's uncovenanted blessings. That is, God can and does heal people in this life. Yes, he does. But he does not promise it. The woman's healing, Jairus' daughter being raised again, are all signs of the kingdom that Jesus has been preaching and is bringing. They are images that point to the healing and new life that Jesus does promise to bring to all believers in the new heavens and the new earth, when he will really remove from us sickness, and death. In the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no crying, there will be no pain, there will be no mourning. But that is then. What about now? If we're not learning that faith leads to healing, then what do we learn? I think these accounts help us to understand how to have faith, how to do what Jesus told Jairus to do, to not fear and only believe in light of the care and the power that Jesus has. He's the person that we place our faith in, and he is shown to us in this passage today. And there are three particular things I notice about the faith of Jairus and of the woman, and in contrast with the unfaith of the Nazarenes, that I think might be helpful for us today. And they are that faith requires a heart open to Jesus. Faith is taking on Jesus' perspective, and that faith is something that is not idle. What do I mean? All right, firstly, faith requires a heart open to Jesus. Now, all the people of today's passage saw or heard reports of Jesus' wisdom and healing power. Yet, why did Jairus and the woman believe Jesus, but the Nazarenes did not? What was the difference? One difference was that the Nazarenes' hearts were hard. They were full of problems and pride, whereas Jairus and the woman's hearts were not. There was no space for pride in their desperation. There was no preoccupation with their own solutions in the face of their hopeless situations. And so they were very open to Jesus' ministry and healing power. But it's also good to note that their faith did not stop there for them. Both Jairus and the woman's encounters with Jesus become more and more personal. As they knew Jesus more and more, their open hearts meant they were able to trust him more and more and more. The Nazarenes, on the other hand, who thought that they already knew everything there was to know about Jesus, sadly did not finally know or trust Jesus in any real way. And of course, this pokes us a bit. What about us? Are our hearts open to Jesus, to trusting him more and more? Or are we like the Nazarenes, where pride or skepticism or whatever else stops us from the inside? Something to think about. Secondly, faith is taking on Jesus' perspective. And we see this most prominently in the second half of Jairus' encounter. Jairus must disregard the sad announcement of his daughter's death and ignore the laughter of the mourners and the people around him. He must trust Jesus' verdict that his daughter is only sleeping, even though all those around him and conventional human wisdom says otherwise. Who has the truer view of death? Jesus or human beings? Again and again, Jesus refers to death as a sleep when it involves a believer. He said the same thing when he raised another man, Lazarus, in John chapter 11. Death is not what it appears to be when faith is present. For the believer, death is merely temporary and not something to be feared truly. It is nothing more serious than going to sleep. And what comfort this is for us. And when Jairus' daughter was raised, Jairus saw that Jesus' perspective is true. The Nazarenes, on the other hand, in their unbelief, do not give up their perspectives of who Jesus is and how the world works. And so they reject Jesus, even when miracles are performed right in front of them. What foolishness. There are many perspectives today, in this world today, on what is wise and what is true. But those of us who profess faith in Jesus are supposed to adopt his views and perspectives on things. Things like how to view death, but also things like how to view sin, how to think about our priorities and values and time use, what is good, what is permissible, what is evil. It's not easy to take Jesus' perspective on things since we are surrounded by voices. It's something that needs practice. As the challenges of life hit us, we often find it far easier to trust in our own thinking and the thinking of those around us than in Jesus. But we do well to remember that having faith in Jesus means that when Jesus and the wisdom of the world differ, we are to trust in Jesus' perspective. And lastly, faith is not idle. Faith led Jairus and the woman to move. Faith is embodied in action. Faith is something that can be seen, like a synagogue leader and an outcast seeking out Jesus and falling at his feet, like men digging through a roof to bring their paralytic friend to the one they believe can heal him. The Nazarenes did not have faith and did not move, and so nothing happened. It's one thing for us to say that we believe in Jesus. It's another thing to act on that belief and to change our lifestyles and our behaviors to walk as our Lord commands and to see his good and true way. Do we act on our faith? Do we trust God, trust Jesus' words, and seek to grow our trust in Jesus more and more by acting on it? Just as Jairus and the woman's journeys of faith took place in steps, God invites us, I think, in today's passage to keep growing in our trust of him. That wherever we are in life, wherever we are in our faith journeys, that we can and should heed Jesus as he calls to us these great words of comfort. Do not fear, only believe. God bless.